はい。はい。それでは定刻となりましたので、ただいま。
As it is time, we'd like to now begin the roundtable discussion on the economics of biodiversity, Dasgupta review. I am Masami Hasegawa, Secretary General of the KCNC, or Keidanren Committee on Nature Conservation, and I'll be facilitating this session. This webinar will be held in conjunction with the British Embassy. Simultaneous interpretation will be provided between Japanese and English. For those who wish to listen to the interpretation, please select the language using the interpretation button at the bottom of your webinar screen. Please also note that today's session will be open to the press, and we plan to post a video of the meeting on YouTube at a later date. As for today's schedule, after opening remarks, we will have an overview of the Dasgupta review from the UK Treasury and a discussion with Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta himself. We would like to begin with a few words from Mr. Futamiya, Chairman of the Keidanren Committee on Nature Conservation. Chairman Futamiya, the floor is yours.
As has been kindly introduced, I am the chair of the Keidanren Committee on Nature Conservation. Allow me to say a few words at the outset. We are privileged to have Sir Partha, the Professor Emeritus of Cambridge University, the representatives of the UK Treasury, Professor Onuma of Keio University, as well as Director General Okuda of the Minister of Environment. I would like to thank all of you for sharing with us your valuable time today. And Her Excellency Ambassador Longbottom, as well as the staff of the UK Embassy, who are the co-organizer of this event. I would like to thank them for their kind endeavors for the preparation. I would like to thank the many participants who are participating on a virtual basis. The KCNC was established in 1992. The same year, the ANSED meeting was held in Rio. The aim of the committee was to put into practice Keidanren Global Environment Charter. Right now, we have 107 Japanese companies as the members. We have established the Keidanren Nature Conservation Fund to support the nature conservation activities of the NGOs in Japan as well as in the other countries with the kind of cooperation on a cumulative basis for the past 28 years. 1,570 projects, 4.4 billion yen and over of the grant support has been given. And the committee is also engaged in education activities. The last month, we have opened the website on the Keidanren Biodiversity the Declaration Initiative. 254 companies and organizations who are supporting us that have shared their activities, examples, and experiences. 126 of such initiatives. There is indeed increased interest over biodiversity in Japan, but there are many challenges as well. How to measure biodiversity and also to put forward the initiatives for improvement and how to factor into the business activities as well as policy of the businesses. Now, for the climate change, there are clear-cut targets as reducing the atmospheric concentration of CO2 as well as 1.5 Celsius degrees and so forth, but we do not have such targets for the biodiversity. Against this backdrop, with the Dasgupta review, which is the main theme of today's event, has been suggesting the accounting price to place into the value, the nature, the capital, and also inclusive the wealth concept has been presented instead of GDP, there is a suggestion and recommendation made to bring forth a transformative change. And such concepts and recommendations, I believe, would be of good reference to the Japanese businesses. Lastly, there are many non-members who are participating today. For the post-Aichi target international frameworks to be established, and also we are also having taken a great interest over TNFD and other information disclosure the frameworks. I very much hope that all of you who would become members of our committee. I hope that today's event would be quite successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Futamiya. We will now hear from the British Ambassador to Japan, Her Excellency Ambassador Julia Longbottom. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman Futamiya, for your opening remarks, and thank you to the Keidanren for hosting this event with us on such an important issue. I'm delighted to see that so many people are joining today and very much welcome the Keidanren's action to engage with Japanese business on something the UK has been working hard to improve and resolve. It's great to see so many people participating today, including from Japan, but I apologize, as we have speakers from the UK as well. I'm going to speak in English today. We've all seen the statistics, and we know that nature is declining at a catastrophic and unprecedented rate. In just the last 50 years, the planet's wildlife populations have plummeted by 68%. We know this is caused largely by our unsustainable relationship with nature, and it's accelerated by climate change. The British government and our Prime Minister are committed to delivering a nature-positive future in which we leave the environment in a better state than we found it, and we reverse biodiversity loss globally by 2030. We've committed, along with the Global Ocean Alliance and the High Ambition Coalition, to protect at least 30% of our land and global oceans by 2030. We're working with our partners to build support for this target ahead of the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of Parties in Kunming next week. We've also earmarked at least £3 billion of our international climate finance over 5 years to nature-based solutions to help restore and protect nature and biodiversity domestically as we mainstream nature into economic and financial decision-making in our public institutions. As part of this effort, the British government commissioned the Dasgupta Review, which we will hear more about today, is the first global assessment of its kind into the economics of biodiversity loss. The review highlights just how urgently we need to take action. I'd like to encourage you to consider taking forward both the review's approaches to economic decision-making and its recommendations for reforming our institutions, businesses, and systems to value nature more. To mainstream nature into our economic and financial decision-making in our public institutions. I hope the webinar today provides you with information and insight into the possibilities and ways in which businesses can make a significant, positive impact to the future of biodiversity issues. And I hope you all have a chance to consider what difference you can make to protecting the world we live in through your work. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing our distinguished speakers today. Thank you.
ロングボトム大使、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Ambassador Longbottom. Now we'd like to ask Mr. Naohisa Okuda, Director General of the Nature Conservation Bureau, Ministry of the Environment, to deliver his greetings. Mr. Okuda, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I am with the Ministry of Environment, Director General for Nature Conservation Bureau. With the initiatives taken by the Keidanren Nature Conservation Committee, as well as the UK government's initiative, as well as Her Excellency Ambassador Longbottom's, and also having Professor Emeritus Dasgupta a long way ahead from the UK also participating. It is a great honor for me to be able to participate alongside all of these dignitaries. I would like to offer my congratulations, and I would also like to express my gratitude for the invitation. Now, from next week, the part one of the CBD COP15 will be started. And at the timing of the post-2020 global diversity framework is being discussed, the UK, who has compiled the stern review for the climate change, focusing on the economic perspective. And this time around, that Dasgupta review has once again been presented by the UK, which is focusing on biodiversity and economics. There is, I believe, a huge relevance for all the debate ongoing at COP and elsewhere. There has been a big impact on the outcome of the G7 summit recently as well. I would like to pay my sincere respects for the prescient view as well as endeavors of Sir Partha as well as the UK in bringing forth the relevance of environment and economics. Japan, in the presidency of COP10, we have put forward the Aichi target for the COP. We have formulated the domestic plans accordingly and tried to expand terrestrial and marine protected area, and also made international contributions through Satoyama Initiative, and also tried to mainstream biodiversity in economy as well as a society. With the UK endeavors, we have come to agreement at G7, and we have been able to put forward 30 by 30, 30% conservation target by 2030, which will be the major target for the post-2020 global diversity framework. The other day, from the former Ministry of Environment, Minister Koizumi has put forth the basic concept for Japan in achieving the 30 by 30. In order to actually implement the 30 by 30, we will put forth a roadmap which will include the concrete steps forward. So by part 2 of COP15, Japan will be able to publish the 30 by 30 roadmap. In achieving the 30 by 30, not only in the protected area, but we need to establish the OECM, other effective area-based conservation measures, where the various stakeholders, including the private sector businesses, will be able to take the ownership for the conservation activities. I believe that it is quite important to establish this OECM. The conservation activities under OECM needs to be properly appreciated. It is crucial to consider the mechanism that would lead to the further growth of the private businesses. And in the Dasgupta review, there has been many suggestions and recommendations in this regard, I understand. On the other hand, in Japan, the ministry has been working with Keidanren to establish the UN Decade on Biodiversity. Japan had a committee which includes the various stakeholders to try to introduce other programs as well as technologies in Japan, aiming for the global biodiversity conservation. We have been working closely with the business community. And in November last year, Keidanren and the Ministry of Environment has launched Biodiversity Business Contribution Project, which is the technology, products, and services case studies have been sorted out, which would contribute to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. In the near future, we will launch the website, and we will also make public the promotion video. So going forward, we would continue to cooperate with the business community to achieve 30 by 30, and also try to reduce the ecosystem, the burden on the biodiversity for the whole of the supply chain. Lastly, I very much hope that today's webinar would be very productive with the active debate to ensue, so that it would be a concrete step forward to mainstreaming the biodiversity. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
局長、
Thank you very much, Director General Okuda. Now, from the UK Treasury, we have Ms. Heather Britton, who will give us an overview of the Dasgupta review. The UK Treasury commissioned the report to the Dasgupta review, and Ms. Britton is a member of the office, and she is promoting and making sure that this penetrates. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind introduction. I have had the privilege of working with Professor Dasgupta over the past year and have supported his participation in a huge variety of events and interviews since the review's publication to help its dissemination. So I hope he doesn't mind me giving a brief introduction to both the review, which was published in February this year, and the formal government response, before we turn to this discussion between Professor Dasgupta and Professor Ayumi Onuma in a few moments. As you're about to hear, the economic consequences of biodiversity loss are often misunderstood or overlooked. And it is for that reason that the UK Treasury commissioned Professor Partha Dasgupta to write his global independent review on the economics of biodiversity. The review is powerful because it is grounded in a deep understanding of ecology and earth sciences and how they are affected by economic activity. The review explores the sustainability of humanity's engagements with nature and provides a comprehensive framework for thinking about biodiversity in the context of our economies. The review makes clear that a fundamental change in how we think about and approach economics is urgently needed if we are to reverse biodiversity loss and protect and enhance our prosperity. The UK government formally responded to the review in June, making commitments including ensuring all new UK bilateral aid spending does no harm to nature, and legislating in England for all nationally significant infrastructure projects to have a net positive impact on biodiversity. And that is not the last word on the review. It will continue to be used to inform government policies in the UK and, we hope, internationally. But I will stop there and allow Professor Dasgupta himself to explain his review's findings in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Britton, for that. We will now begin the roundtable discussion with Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. Today, Professor Ayumi Onuma of Keio University will act as a facilitator, and including questions that have been submitted in advance, the discussion will be conducted by Professor Onuma being the moderator. So over to you, Professor Onuma.
Professor Dasgupta. Thank you very much for joining us. Today, I'm very honored to be interviewing you again, following my role as an interviewer for your Blue Planet Prize lecture 6 years ago. Yes. Very nice to meet you again. Yes. Your review is gaining growing attention in Japan. For example, the day before yesterday, Sunday, one of Japan's top newspapers, the Asahi Shimbun, featured it very extensively. Also, it's used in the place of education. In fact, I've been using it in my university seminar since April, and the students have been reporting on it every week. They are being impressed very much, yes. Many business persons here on Zoom today are looking forward to hearing from Professor Dasgupta. Yes. On behalf of them, I'd like to ask you as many questions as time permits. Yes. So please allow me to ask a question in Japanese from here. それでは、ダスグプタ教授にですね。
So, Professor Sir Partha, including the questions which have been submitted by others, I should like to ask questions about the substance of the Dasgupta review. First, in the Dasgupta review, with regard to the substance of biodiversity, in the first half, detailed information is given. What kind of crisis has been brought on by the current loss of biodiversity, and what is the significance of approaching this crisis from an economic standpoint? As the title shows, Economics of Biodiversity. It's an economics approach. So what is the significance of this taking this economic approach? If you could address this first, please, Sir Partha.
Thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to meet you again. It's, as you say, 6 years or so. First of all, in regard to your question, first of all, although the title of the review is The Economics of Biodiversity, I found it, on reflection and reading the ecological sciences, earth sciences, that the review really ought to be about the biosphere, of which biodiversity is a characteristic. Right? So, and of course, there are many ways of thinking about biodiversity, many ways of measuring it. It's not a unique, it's not a head count of species only. It is many other functional biodiversity is important of ecosystems. Now, the reason it was useful to move away from biodiversity per se as a symptom of the health of ecosystems is that I could concentrate on ecosystems as constituents of the biosphere and place the biosphere as a capital asset in which we are embedded. The human economy is embedded. And my task, my job was to study ecosystems as capital assets, which we can degrade if we overuse it, and identify reasons as to why we might be tempted to overuse it, and in fact, end up overusing it. And that's basically the broad background. And the idea was to bring ecosystems on a par with physical capital of the kind that we manufacture, like furniture, roads, buildings, and so forth, and human capital. Human capital and produced capital, if you like, are the two types of capital assets that economists study, in particular in terms of estimating long-term growth possibilities, economic possibilities. And what is missing are natural capital, that is to say, all the machinery out there, nature's machinery out there, which is churning out goods and services, which we then use. So that's the first point. The second point, to answer your question very directly, we are in a terrible state at the moment. There's no ifs and buts about it. People mention it, and my task was, in the review, was to give a detailed empirical picture of how far we've gone into our overshooting for the demands that we make on nature and nature's capacity to respond and supply it on a sustainable basis. So what's currently going on is that we are taking more out of nature than she's able to replenish. And the way that can happen is that nature diminishes in productivity. So that's the story. I wanted to place the economics of biodiversity, see it as an asset management problem, not only at the level of national governments, but also international sphere and down to the level of the household, which is one reason the review is very long, 600 pages. But I have prepared a 100-page briefer summary for the average citizen, if you like, who does not wish to look into the mathematical structure of the problem. I hope that's a reasonable synopsis of the motivation of my review.
はい、非常によくわかりました。
Yes, I understood very well. Thank you. To treat nature as our asset, and the importance of this is emphasized, and I understood that very well. Next, moving on to the next question. In our society, one of the major environmental challenges is the issue of climate change. And this issue is easy for us to understand because it's an issue of carbon. And so policy objectives are such that it's about reducing carbon emission from the Earth as a whole. So it's fairly simple. But biodiversity has many constituents, various ecological systems of various species, and these each exist locally and not globally. So when you try to protect diversity, biodiversity, what would be the metrics to measure biodiversity as is carbon for climate change?
Thank you very much. A very, very good question. It's a deep question. Okay, I'm going to start right from the beginning with the first part about climate change. Climate change or climate regulation that nature provides is only one of the many, many services that nature provides us with. Of course, nature wasn't designed to provide it for us. We have evolved in a world in which nature operates. We're just part of nature, okay? So that has to be recognized. Biodiversity is only one, the climate change is only one of them. And you're right to point out that there is a simple metric, or at least we think there is a simple metric of carbon emission. But actually, it's not so much carbon emission, it's carbon concentration in the atmosphere, which is a stock. Now, think of this way, that we should think of the atmosphere as a capital good, capital asset, into which which is used as a sink for our emissions. The moment you do that, the economics of climate change becomes a part of the economics of biodiversity in the way I described it, because it's concerned with maintaining the health of a particular asset, namely the atmosphere, as a repository of our waste, okay? The problem is that climate regulation is only one among many other services Mother Nature offers us. And one of the weaknesses of the received economics of climate change has been that it has isolated climate regulation as a service that nature provides us from all the other services that Mother Nature provides us. For example, nitrogen fixation, for example, decomposition of waste, for example, pollination, and so forth. Now, the problem with these services that I've just now enumerated is that they're complementary to one another. The processes that are leading nature to offer us these services are complementary. They're not substitutes and they're not independent, which means if you put too much pressure on any one of them, the others start crumbling down as well, which is why the review studies the biosphere as a whole and then breaks up into components. The second point to mention is that biodiversity, the economics of biodiversity is not a local problem only. Think of the oceans, the open oceans. They are a global public good. Without the oceans, we are all dead. The human economy will just not only not survive, it'll be crushed. And yet it's an open access resource. We don't pay for its use. We can fish without paying any rent for it. We can ship goods across the Pacific Atlantic without paying any rent for it, for the traffic charges. And so, of course, we overuse it. So these are global public goods. These are global problems. But of course, they're also local, as you rightly point out, for local ecosystems at the household level. So is there a single metric? The answer is no, there isn't a single metric, but there isn't a single metric even for distinction between a manufacturing sector of an economy and the agricultural sector of an economy. We break up the economy in traditional economics into various sectors. And we then think about the productivity of the various sectors and ask whether investment ought to go in one direction rather than another. typically we rely on the market prices and entrepreneurs to decide how to break their investment into different categories. We don't have that privilege in our treatment of nature because much of nature is not under market supervision because property rights don't exist. Much of nature is free. Worse, we subsidize the use of nature to the tune of something like $3 to $5 trillion a year. So in other words, nature comes with a negative price. So we put even further pressure on it, okay? So yes, it's a more complicated problem, but no, it's not an impossible problem because if we treat nature in the way I'm suggesting in the review, we shall look for the productivity of ecosystems and then arrange investment directed at those which are most productive, okay? And for that, you do need the expert advice of ecologists. It's not simply an entrepreneurial problem. Entrepreneurs need information about the assets on which investment is going to be, should be or may not be put in. And for that, you need to know something about the mechanics of the asset, the processes that are guiding its productivity. For that, you need ecologists. Once you do that, these are soluble problems. We have plenty of examples of wetlands, mangroves, coral reefs, which studies of them, where you can see the gains we would have in directing investment in reviving those which have been eroded through overuse. I hope that is a partial explanation, but it was a very good question. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Mr. Partha.
それではですね、
Now,
次にですね、
let me turn to
経済学
next question on economics. From the perspective of economics, allow me to ask one question.
長らく経済学
Professor, you have been specializing on economics for many, many decades. In the review, you mentioned that the credible economics needs to be informed by credible ecology. That is what is stressed by the review. Why have economists overlooked nature for so long up until now? Or how does the idea that we are embedded within nature change how we think about economics? So if you could elaborate on these points, please.
There are two parts of your question, and the first part is very hard for me to answer because I'm not really a sociologist of science. I don't know how we came to miss it in our profession. I was very attracted to the subject because it seemed to me to be intriguing. I came across some very distinguished ecologists who have trained me over the past 30 years. So I've begun to appreciate the place of nature in our lives in a more scientific way than before. I think one possible reason, a nice, a friendly reading of the misuse of economics, is that much of nature is silent and she's invisible. Many of the processes that we need to understand are silent and invisible. Think of the processes under our feet in the soils, deep in the soils. Lots of things are happening there, but soil ecology is something that most of us don't even begin to learn. Okay. Farmers don't understand it either. They don't care because they have technological advances which enable them to produce a lot of food without really understanding the damage, necessarily understanding the damage they're causing on the natural processes. So silence and invisibility also means that they are missed. So it may be partly to do with that. But I wouldn't wish to go beyond that to speculate as to how our subject has ignored it. The important thing for me to express here in public is that it is not economics which is at fault. Economics is a magnificent social science. Our teachers handed over to us a brilliant grammar. The problem is we have misused it. We've misused it by ignoring this huge asset base on which our economy stand. Second part of your question about embeddedness is a really deep one. And it is important to recognize the only way to, I think I can explain it, is to go back to the received economics of climate change, which sees the conventional model of growth and distribution and poverty without any mention of climate change, any mention of nature, and thinks of economic possibilities exclusively in terms of the accumulation of produced capital and human capital. And then the economics of climate change typically builds onto it a climate model, okay? And then sees emissions as a byproduct of output, of GDP, let us say, and that the emissions result in an additional concentration, and that concentration in the atmosphere has a negative impact on output or welfare or whatever. That's, you know, some damage function, okay? So that you can then build the story around an additional sector which has been planted onto the conventional model, which has no nature in it. I think it has been a perfectly reasonable first move, but I think we should abandon it now. We need to abandon it because we are embedded in it. By embedded means that you really have to trace everything from source to sink. It's not simply looking at the output, but the output then has to be degraded, and that requires nature that puts stress onto nature, because when nature operates to decompose our waste, it assembles a huge amount of machinery, natural machinery. And the more waste you plant on it, the more difficult it becomes for nature to absorb it. Climate emissions is a very good example. After all, it's a biodegradable waste. Trees pick it up, plants pick it up, all right? But if you put too much pressure on it, on that process, then nature can't handle it. So we must remember that. So the model of this, the underlying model that I've given in the review looks at our human activity from top to bottom, from start to finish, from source to sink. And there, the data and ecological principles tells us that in terms of material output, there has to be a finite bound. We cannot rely, conventional models of economics think that human ingenuity, our cleverness, our brains, can overcome nature's constraints if we are smart enough by accumulating physical capital and human capital in particular, and knowledge. My review argues, and I hope you are finding persuasively, given the evidence, that indefinite increase is not possible. We have to reorient it. But when I say reorient, it's not a planning problem. We need to put prices on our activities, on the goods we use, and how it will shape up, how the composition of our output and our consumption and our demands will change if we place a price on our activities. I cannot judge. Nobody can judge. But the fact is, we need to put a price. We need to cost it. We need to be made to pay for the use of nature. I hope that's a sort of a succinct attempt at answering a very difficult question you posed. But thank you for asking it.
Thank you very much. Economics. In economics, in different sectors, there is an increase of studies, including the environment. And based on the Dasgupta review, different research, I believe, will develop in diverse ways. Next, in the review, an important concept which appears is that of inclusive wealth. This inclusive wealth, in considering sustainability, is better than the GDP as a benchmark. And that is what is stated in the Dasgupta review. This inclusive wealth, related to what you said earlier, to consider biodiversity as an asset. I believe these two are connected concepts. Could you explain once again about inclusive wealth and what it is? I think this would enhance our understanding. And the policy makers of government so that they will include inclusive wealth in their policy objectives. What can be done to promote that? What should we do to encourage them to include inclusive wealth in policy objectives? I'd like to hear your views on this, Professor Partha, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's already happening. Several countries are now moving in the direction of creating an inventory of their capital stocks, if you like. But of course, concentration is at the moment on natural capital, in the way I've just been describing ecosystems, for example, as capital assets. So the idea is to move from flow accounts, income expenditure accounts, to capital accounts as a way of judging future possibilities that are open to an economy. So that's the first point. Secondly, Japan, your own country, has some of the finest experts on inclusive wealth. And I'll come back to the notion of inclusive wealth in a minute. Professor Managi, who is a colleague of mine, has picked it up and produced an extremely important report in 2018 with colleagues at the United Nations Environment Programme to produce the Inclusive Wealth of Nations, a cross-section study over time movements of inclusive wealth over the past 15, 20 years. From 1992 to 2010, one of their striking findings has been that per capita produced capital globally has increased by a factor of 2. So it has doubled between 1992 and 2010. Human capital has increased by about 15% during that same period, per capita human capital. But per capita natural capital has shrunk by about 40%. So that's been a sort of a dramatic way of describing what we have already discussed, which is the demand we make on nature has far exceeded nature's capacity to supply it on a sustainable basis. Inclusive wealth is simply wealth, but including natural capital, not just physical produced capital and human capital, but natural capital as well. And that's the first correction, which I make it inclusive. And the second is that, of course, since natural capital very often doesn't have any market prices, you need to estimate social prices for them. The product, in other words, try and estimate those prices on the basis of the productivity of the various forms of capital assets. This is a hard task. I'm not suggesting it's easy. And we are not going to have inclusive wealth accounts in the near future. Even if a government wants to do it, it will not be able to do it because prices are missing and there'll be lots and lots of missing items. But that shouldn't worry us because many, many things are missing in GDP estimates as well. For example, all the exchanges that take place within the household, they're not included. And it's a typical story that we tell when discussing GDP, that it misses many things. But you have to live in an imperfect world, that's fine. I think what will happen now is that countries will begin to have an inventory of natural capital assets. So at the end of each year, the national accounts will carry information about the state of the natural capital assets in the country's jurisdiction, so to speak, compare it with the previous year. Some will have improved, some wetlands will be healthier, some will have declined. And that's extremely important information. Of course, if you had a wealth account, you would be able to put a price on each of these. And therefore, you could then see whether wealth has increased or declined. That would be the ideal, but that may not happen for a while. But for some items, you can have prices. You can estimate prices. For example, for forests, you might use just timber as a first approximation, the timber content, and thereby say acreage, and thereby give us an idea of how much of loss to wealth has occurred by transforming forests into, say, agricultural land and so forth. Inclusive wealth, I should say, finally, this is not simply an arbitrary measure. The review proves formally, analytically, that wealth, inclusive wealth, and social well-being are deeply connected notions. If one goes up, the other goes up. If one goes down, the other goes down. So even though wealth is not the same as well-being, they move in the same direction. So any talk of sustainable development has no meaning unless we think in terms of whether inclusive wealth has gone up or down. If it has gone down, then you're not on a sustainable development path. Okay. So it's extremely important to recognize it's not just an arbitrary suggestion that the review makes. There's a deep reasoning behind the suggestion that we should move away from GDP to wealth accounts for long-term decision-making. For short-run macroeconomic management, GDP is extremely important. Goes without saying, that's why it was devised that way. It was devised for that purpose. Keynesian arithmetic demanded that. But somehow after the Second World War, GDP assumed the role of an index of welfare, but it was not meant to do that. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the simplest explanation account I can give to your question.
Thank you very much. As for inclusive wealth, the concept is closely linked with the happiness and welfare of the people. And inclusive wealth grows, that would also mean the happiness and welfare for the people will also grow. So biodiversity matters greatly in this regard, is what you have amply explained to us. Thank you. Now, when we look at inclusive wealth and how to measure the inclusive wealth, as Partha has been mentioning, pricing, that the price setting needs to be done, has been repeatedly mentioned. So for inclusive wealth, rather than the market price, you have been suggesting the use of accounting price. Can you explain in brief what is an accounting price? And from the accounting price point of view, the market price of biodiversity is much less valuable, that is too cheap. But is it necessary to correct the market price so that it would come closer to the accounting price? Is that what you're suggesting? Please.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. I think the best way of thinking about accounting price is to give an illustration. By the accounting price, you mean the social worth of an asset. The accounting price of an asset or an accounting price of a service is the social worth of that service. It's what it contributes to social well-being. You would mention happiness. Take a simple example. Consider a mangrove forest in an estuary. Okay, it offers certain services which we take for granted. One of them being that it provides a buffer against storms for neighboring villages which people live next to the mangrove forest. Okay, that's one. It provides some fuel wood for the inhabitants. That's another. And of course, equally important, it provides a nursery for fish. Okay. Imagine now the market price for the mangrove is zero, because it's not a private your owned asset. You can still ask, what are the services that the mangrove is offering? Say the villages, the fishing industry, and so forth, by being a nursery for fisheries. Those can be monetized. What about the pressure, the protection it affords, the mangrove forest affords the villages against storms? And in Japan, that's a very reasonable question to ask. And you can determine in monetary terms, the average protection that the mangrove forest offers, even over a 10-year period, 15-year period. You have data on that kind of thing from other places. Okay, using those bits of information, you can get some idea of the social price or accounting price of the mangrove, which will of course be reflected in the inclusive wealth of the country in which the mangrove happens to be, because mangrove will be part of the natural capital system of the economy. I don't know if that makes sense, but it is true. Market prices on average are way below accounting prices. There are now tons and tons of work that has been done by environmental and resource economists over the past 20, 30 years, trying to estimate accounting prices of specific pieces of natural capital. and we need to build on them, collate them, and put them together in national accounts. And in the review tries to do that in a very preliminary way, of course.
ありがとうございます。市場
Thank you very much. What was not considered in market prices, important roles and services related to biodiversity. These should be incorporated in the economy as prices. I believe that is what this boils down to. Going forward for the economic society, this will be an important development, I am sure. Thank you.
May I interrupt for 1 minute? I'm sorry to interrupt. I forgot to mention one thing. In a sense, we have been discussing accounting prices in the economics of climate change. When people talk about the social cost of carbon, that's an accounting price. That's exactly what it is. And the idea is to see what the damage additional emission does to economies in terms of lower output or whatever. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought I should mention the connection.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you. CO2 emission, we emitted without paying any charges. But when you consider social impacts, you have to price them. And so the same applies to the concept of biodiversity. Thank you. So,
次にですね、
moving on,
少しビジネスのところで、
related to business,
で先ほど
earlier on, you talked about the loss of biodiversity, and that is a crisis. And in particular, for the business sector, the loss of biodiversity, what kind of crisis will it manifest itself as, if we could put this question to you?
Well, thank you very much. My review's attempt was to unify our understanding of the human economy from the level, at every level, from the household upwards to the international community, via governments, public sector, private sector, and so forth. Because so much of nature is underpriced, essentially priced at zero, people do not have the incentive to record their use. If something is free, what do you care? At the individual level, you regard it as an infinite source because you don't have to pay a price, okay? So the intuitive notion is that for the individual level, at the level of the individual, a resource which is priced at zero is of infinite extent. So there's no need to husband it. The only reason you don't go ask for infinite amount is that harvesting cost creeps up. You don't have enough time to consume so much. So you limit it, not because the price is positive, but because you don't have the capacity to destroy it any faster, okay? So our excess demand comes out of that fact. Now, what about companies? The fact is, of course, companies require primary products for their outputs. So take, for example, the stuff you buy in the supermarket, say coffee. Well, coffee is the finished product that you're getting. You're buying coffee beans, let us say, which you then transform in your home into drinkable coffee, okay? But those beans come from abroad, maybe from Africa, and it's a coffee plantation, okay? So there's a huge long supply chain of companies which have a long track across the continents. And the way biodiversity laws affect companies, as I think there's something very distinctive about the problem, arising out of the fact that the bulk of the world's biodiversity, the richest ecosystems in terms of the silent and invisible services we enjoy, are in the tropics. For example, in, say, the peatlands there, but most importantly, the rainforest, the tropical rainforests in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and so forth, okay? They're in the tropics. It's also the case that some of the world's poorest countries are in the tropics. Africa is a very good instance of that, an ideal instance of that, if you like, for my purposes. Okay. Now, when ecosystems, the pressure is imposed on ecosystems there because of the demand by the importing country or the importing company, which is not paying all the price that needs to be paid because some of it is free, some of the sources are free, some of the services are free, then of course it impinges also on the people who live there. Now, it's a very, very important point to remember, which I think the review highlights, but I have not seen it ever discussed by the WTO, for example, the World Trade Organization, is that because so much of nature is underpriced, some of these hidden services are underpriced, poor countries, primary product producers, when they export primary products to, say, rich countries, they lose income, they lose wealth, because some of their assets are being drawn down. These hidden assets are being drawn down, which are not being priced. So the export prices are lower than the social cost of production of those primary products, which are then exported. Okay, so the market price is below, again, the social price, the accounting price. And so, which is another way of saying there's a wealth transfer from the poor countries who are exporting to the rich countries which are importing. Now that's absurd, isn't it? When you think about it, it's an outrage. But nobody's at fault here, in the sense I'm not suggesting this is capitalism gone wrong, or I'm not suggesting that there is conspiracy here. It's not that. Nobody has noticed it. In fact, primary producing countries are trying hard to expand their export in order to earn revenue, in order to invest. But notice, you're doing that by mining your natural capital, i.e. in the exporting country, and then converting it into roads, buildings, and so forth. Exactly the things that are shaping up large in the rest of the world. So what about the importing company? It faces heightened risk on their supply, in their profitability, because of the risk attached to the collapse of ecosystems from which they're importing goods. Okay, so that's the problem. The problem, however, there's one good news here, which is that the risks that these companies face, these are all importing primary products from poor countries, they're correlated. If the ecosystem from which I'm deriving the primary product starts collapsing or degrades, making my profitability lower, then that's happening also to my neighboring company, which is importing primary products from a neighboring ecosystem in that country, in that same country. So my risk is correlated with your risk if you and I happen to be competing companies. And they're correlated also with the risks that the exporters are facing. Because of course, they're sitting on that biodiversity, and if they're losing it, the profit, their income is also under threat. So there is a confluence of interest now across companies which are importing from primary products from poor countries, as well as the exporters themselves. But if you think about the importing companies, one advantage of this correlation, positive correlation, is that they have an incentive, a real interest to act collectively and ask their governments to insist that they disclose their entire conditions on their supply chain. Why? The reason is that disclosure can act as a substitute for missing markets. All these markets are missing. Part of it has to do with moral hazard. Part of it has to do with what I've been insisting on during this interview, which is that so much of nature is underpriced. But like any other collective action problem, here is one where companies do have an incentive to ask their governments to require of them to disclose. Disclosure means what? It means that they have to show how they're treating the ecosystem from which they are importing goods, so that the customer, the consumer, you and I, when we purchase our coffee, know what's happening there. And if we care about the environment, if we care about biodiversity, we mean our citizens, not the companies, the citizens, then we will insist on good practice. At the moment, we don't know what good practice means. because we don't know what's happening in the supply chain. On health products, by the way, on food products, we do know. Today, all our health products, food products, have information given over its fat content, sugar content, salt content, and so forth. Why do they disclose it? They disclose it because we consumers care about our health and we insist that they disclose it. If they didn't, we wouldn't know what we're eating, and therefore there would be a market failure there. Likewise, the review is suggesting that there is now a real strong incentive on companies who are importing primary products to get together and start disclosing, but they won't do it individually necessarily. They'll need a strong arm of the government to say, no, you must do this because customers want it. And customers can, of course, urge their governments to impose such a condition. It will help the profitability of the companies themselves. That's the reason. They have an incentive to do that. I don't know if this makes sense, but it's one way of, I think, marshalling the arguments about the increasing risks that companies face as a result of biodiversity loss, because so much of our primary products are primary products and they're using up natural capital.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Now, you mentioned about the information disclosure, that overall, it is necessary to disclose the information. And as you have rightly pointed out, looked from individual producers' point of view, we need to assess the supply chain. We need to conduct monitoring on supply chain. And I believe the companies do understand the importance of that. But from individuals' producers' point of view, there may be difficulty involved in going about. So how can we suggest the practical suggestions? Would you be able to suggest any effective ways in going about this?
Yes, well, as I was suggesting, this is a collective action problem. And I was suggesting that it is in the interest of the companies themselves not to individually disclose. I wasn't suggesting that, but it's in their interest to talk to each other, as it were, and then agree that it's in their collective interest, and therefore the individual interest, to disclose. But that won't necessarily happen unless they're asked to do that, or compelled to do that. And one way of doing that, of course, is the state compelling them. But why would the state wish to do that? In a democratic society, they will wish to do that only if we citizens insist that the state does that. It has happened, as I was suggesting, with food products. After all, there's a huge amount of disclosure now on food, what we eat. And that disclosure comes about because we citizens have insisted on having that done, because we need to know what we are eating. When you're buying a refrigerator, you don't need to know what's inside the refrigerator, the mechanics of it. You don't need to know the engineering. Why? The reason is that you have a notion of what is a reasonable supply, the performance of the refrigerator. And you have a contract with the seller that for the next 3 years or 4 years, there will be free service provided. If anything goes wrong with the refrigerator, they'll fix it. We don't have that here, you see. In the case of our dealings with natural capital, because if an ecosystem collapses there, we as a consumer would not know that it has, if you see what I mean. It'll only happen through the fluctuating profits of the importing country, and the risk is increasing because the threat to their sources is expanding, is accentuating. So it's not that the individual company will necessarily have an incentive to do that, although there are ethical investors, by the way. I mean, it's happening a bit. The investors, the average citizen, when he or she invests, wants to know what the company does. We are beginning to see that happening. And so there is occasional cases there that I know of where companies might say, look, others aren't doing it, but if I do it, then my reputation improves. Because I can say, I'm an ethical company. I'm doing this, that, and the other to protect the biodiversity from which I'm using inputs. And there's some advantage of that, but you can't rely on that exclusively. And that's why I was suggesting that you need collective action on the part of the companies themselves. Or alternatively, the pressure could come from us. as citizens. We could ask our governments to say, but look, you've got to have them disclose what they're doing because we are worried about it. We are worried about the fate of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we need to protect the biodiversity in the tropics. I hope that's reasonably
あり
clear.
がとうございます。非常によく
Thank you very much. I understood very well. In particular, from the standpoint of the citizens, to ask for disclosure to companies going forward, I think will become increasingly significant, more so than ever before.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you for that.
それではですね、もう少し今度、
Now, moving
今先ほど生
on.
態系の劣化のリスクということを
Biodiversity loss risk is something that you mentioned
生態系の
earlier.
リスクに対処するために
In order to deal with the risk of degradation of biosphere, a global risk pool is what you have proposed in the review. Can you explain what it is and how can insurance companies and the financial sectors contribute?
ということをですね、お話し
Right.
Could you address the subject, please?
Sure. It's, again, a wonderful question. We have in the review, of course, there's a good deal of mention of the place of insurance. One problem that we need to recognize in the case of biodiversity loss is that because nature is not only silent and invisible, it's also she's very mobile, which of course is something that we economists understand very well, because mobility means that there are these huge externalities that are transferred from one place to another. So you, let's say you dump some plastic in the Bahamas, and that same plastic is found eventually in Iceland because the ocean currents take it out there. So these externalities are rampant. Okay, but that also means that these risks are correlated because nature is interconnected. And interconnection really means correlation. If one part of the system experiences declining its productivity, then another one does so as well, because these externalities are damaging externalities. If you damage one thing, you damage something else elsewhere, and maybe sometimes in the future. It may take some time. In any case, transport takes time. So we're looking at both a spatial and a temporal dimension in these externalities. Okay. When you have correlated risk, of course, insurance is a problem. Insurance markets work very well if the risks are independent of each other. Like in accident, automobile accident, whether I'm a bad driver or a good driver or an accident takes place is independent of whether you face an accident, because it's a different situation. So on average, the insurance market can flourish because for the standard actuarial reasons, okay. The problem is if they're positively correlated, you have serious difficulty of finding insurance, because if I buy the insurance, you don't, but your action is going to affect mine, so my probability it changes, and so it really makes it very difficult. So it can be done, of course. People do purchase insurance, but they pay a huge premium in order to go to purchase it because of these correlations. So for that reason, one of the things that we highlight in the review, I was very keen on highlighting, is that instead of thinking in terms of insurance, we should think in terms of investment in nature to keep nature from becoming unhealthy. When I say nature, I mean, of course, systems, say grassland or a wetland or a mangrove forest or a coral reef, or you name it, or a forest patch. So the idea is that you don't insure because huge moral hazard issues are involved here, plus other people's activities are involved here, so as insurance markets don't work very well. So the idea would be to actually make investment in nature. And I think one of the things that we forget is that investment in nature is a lot, at least upfront investment costs are very low, upfront. Because let's say, take the extreme case, you plant a seed and initially do some watering and protecting it against, say, predators, maybe human predators, but never mind, okay? But other than that, what the investment really involves waiting. You wait for nature to grow, to get back to health, a piece of natural capital. So the incentive for doing that is low because, of course, the price is low. The market price is low. But the accounting price can be very high. And more important, the accounting price of nature relative to physical capital or produced capital and human capital will be rising. Because remember, I gave you the example of the Managi finding a few minutes ago. The natural capital has been declining, whereas physical capital, produced capital has been increasing and natural capital has been increasing. In other words, the asset composition at the global level has gone in a way in which natural capital is becoming more and more scarce relative to produced capital and human capital as the years go by. Therefore, the accounting price of natural capital relative to produced capital will be increasing. So the worry that waiting is very costly because you discount something and the benefits of your investment come, planting an oak tree, let's say, the benefit comes about 50 years, 60 years from now. If you use a reasonable discount rate, the whole thing gets vanished and it's not worth it. But that's a wrong calculation because the value of the oak tree will be increasing over time because of the argument I've just now given you. Therefore, the discount rate that you might be using, should be ideally the accounting discount rate, may be negative, not positive, negative, because it's becoming more and more valuable. Okay. So there are good things ahead of us if we think logically. Economics, as I said, is a very powerful language to use when put to nature. We misuse it. So I've been very concerned while writing the review in clearing up these possible objections, saying that it's all very well for you to say you invest in nature, but what's the payoff? What's the profitability? By the way, I used to be asked this question of my colleagues in the Indian government when I was writing a report for the Indian government on India's national accounts and suggesting that they move to an inclusive wealth framework. And that was submitted in 2013. My old friends of mine who are now in the government at that time, chief secretaries would say, Partha, it's all very well, but we have to worry about the bottom line. And the bottom line says that nature is not much product, the payoff from investing in nature is rather low. And no environmentalist explains to me why I shouldn't invest in nature. And I had to use these arguments, and I put them together. So I would say I wouldn't rely that much on insurance markets, but on investment. That's the best kind of insurance because it's insuring against the ecosystem having a breakdown. Whereas normal insurance would say, if it has a breakdown, I want to be compensated because I paid for its possible breakdown. And that change, I think, from one system of thought to another, I think is extremely important.
Thank you very much. What you have just described, that investment into nature is quite important. So in this regard, I have another question that I would like to ask you. When private sector businesses make investment, they need to do some funding activity. And investors' money tended to concentrate into safe and highly profitable investments where they could have more returns. But the flow of money needs to be changed, to be steered toward biodiversity conservation and investment into nature. So how should we transform and change the financial sector in this regard? Any suggestions, please?
Well, very difficult question to answer, and you would be much better. People who are listening to this program would be far greater experts than I on this matter. I do see the problem very deeply, largely because market prices which rule the investment strategies, not accounting prices. So far, we've talked about accounting prices, but if they're not there on the table, how do you do that? I've also tried to give you an idea that maybe it's in the interest of the financial sector, the importing countries, companies to collude, to disclose and so forth. But okay, leave that aside now. It seems to me a great deal of weight on this problem is going to have to be borne by government. One way they can do it, as the UK is beginning to think in terms of, is to issue green bonds. So that's a guarantee that the investment is going to go towards nature protection and so forth. So the burden of that investment is taken up by an assurance by the state that such investment will take place. In other words, that's a way of introducing accounting prices. Ideally, that's the way of introducing accounting prices in investment decisions, as opposed to market prices, or rather, add accounting prices to many of the goods and services that are in the investment outlay, which are where the market prices are way off. So remember, the idea is to know what you want to see happen and then work backwards to find a way for that to happen. Okay, it's not a question of first finding out because Dasgupta is saying there ought to be green bonds. It's a good idea to have green bonds, that we should have green bonds. The question is, why do we need green bonds? The reason that we do is that you don't have the incentive in the marketplace for doing that. So some kind of a guarantee that the returns will be financial returns to the investor buying stocks, shares, in this case, bonds. And that guarantee can only come from the state, because to the extent that the companies the private companies will not acknowledge accounting prices. Okay, so we've gone through now a sequence of examples in this interview, and I'm grateful to you for asking these very important questions, where I've shown to the extent that there are incentives inbuilt in the problem for the private sector to take action. And then the latest question you've asked is one where you're saying, no, but it's not going to close the gap. You need something more. And I think in this case, it is very much the state. Now, this is not new in one sense. It's not new because when I was growing up back in the 50s and 60s, 1960s, the state was extremely important in pretty much all at least certainly in India. And my guess is, I don't know about Japan, certainly in India, it was extremely important for the state to enter into certain types of investment activity. In those days, it used to be heavy capital goods sector. The argument was that the private sector does not have the, at least in the Indian context, there was the thought that they could not be relied upon to invest sufficiently on infrastructure, for example. That has to be a bit roads and so forth, dams. These are the projects that the government is supposed to do. Why? Same reason, that the profitability would be too low, particularly given the investment outlay for the private sector. So the idea that the state gets engaged in some investment or redirects investment in a particular way through clever means is nothing new. It's just that it's never been deployed for protecting Mother Nature. And what the review does is to try and find ways by which that can happen.
ありがとうございます。グリーンボンドはイギリスで、販売されたときに非常に人気が高かったということをお聞きしていますが、今後我々機関投資家だけではなくて個人の
Green bonds, when it was first issued, was very popular in the UK. That is what I understand. Not only institutional investors, but individual investors must be steered to choose portfolio giving consideration to biodiversity. And I believe that is what I've taken away from what Professor Partha has said. And having said so, the government and the state would have to provide to us such a scheme, and that would be very important. In the Dasgupta review, ecological footprint appears very often in the report. And what is used in the Dasgupta review, alpha, the letter alpha represents technology. We would think in terms of climate change, various technology contributes to mitigation and adaptation. But in the crisis of loss of biodiversity, to what extent would technology prove to be useful? What are your thoughts on this, please?
Thank you very much. Yes, there is a partial place for technology. One of the things that the review does is to argue, I hope with evidence and reason, that we should shy away from thinking that technology will be the savior of the day. That has been a big mistake, and it was transported, as I was suggesting earlier, into the received economics of climate change. And I think that has been a bit unfortunate, because it so happened that in the case of climate change, there is a viable, potentially a viable technology which is clean. You see what I mean? Wind and solar and so forth. But we should be under no illusion that technology is there available for reducing this problem. There are some areas, of course, biotechnology is one. If you can genetically modified crops is one, which is another way of increasing alpha. You need less land, let us say, to produce the food that you need and so forth. So you need less encroachment on natural capital. The tension that we've had, you were asking about the impact equation, that is our demand ecological footprint. One way of thinking about the problem, and that's how we begin in the review, is to look at the demands humanity makes on nature's goods and services on an annual basis, let us say, and nature's ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. And currently, it's the gap between the demand and supply is huge. The ratio of demand to supply has been estimated, at least by one reasonably, as the best estimate that I can think of, is about 1.6 or 1.7, which gives length to the metaphor that we need 1.6 Earths to satisfy our needs. That's one way of expressing it. And the reason I began with the impact equation is that the inequality, that is the demand and the supply, and the fact that demand exceeds the supply, is that we are in a firefighting situation globally. So it's part of inclusive wealth, of course, because demand exceeding supply means that nature is depleting. And that bit of nature, that is nature as a capital asset, that this impact inequality, the demand and supply gap, will be reflected in the inclusive wealth changes. Because if the impact inequality is very large, then the gap is very large, then of course wealth, that part of the component of wealth, which is natural capital, will be declining at a fast rate. So inclusive wealth is related to this, but the impact inequality is extremely important because that lends us attention to it. Now, what I did was to decompose the demand into, as you say, alpha, the technology factor, the efficiency with which we convert nature's goods and services into final products, and also recognizing that the demand depends on our final products, which is GDP. So globally, it's population times average GDP divided by alpha, which is the demand. That's the way I decomposed it. You could decompose it in other ways, but this decomposition tells us which are the parameters which are affecting our demand and supply of nature's goods and services. And on the right-hand side is, of course, nature's ability to regenerate itself, okay? So the right-hand side is about investment. The supply side is to be met by investment in it, and the demand side has to be done by either reducing our global GDP or increasing the efficiency by which we transform. And that efficiency, we can do some things. As I said, biotechnology is one, and there are other things we can do, many things, by reviving ecosystems and so forth. But on the whole, I think it's a mistake to think that alpha, the efficiency parameter, is the way to go. Because we've tried over and over again technological solutions, and the problem is Mother Nature is so intricate, so mysterious, that you try and solve one problem and 5 other problems show up without your knowing, not anticipating it. You see, it's like, you're creating you plug one hole and another hole starts in the bathtub because you don't know how the bathtub reacts to your activities. So I'm very conservative at the moment on the idea that we can find technological solutions to the dilemma that we have created about our place in nature.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. The importance of technology and the limit and constraints of that was well explained by Sir Partha in view of biodiversity. Of course, Dasgupta, a review that has been published by the UK Treasury, and also the Stern Review on climate change had extreme impact on policy making worldwide. And I'm sure Dasgupta review going forward will also have similar major impact on policy making when it comes to nature conservation or biodiversity conservation. One important pillar of the environmental policy in any country, of course, you would have biodiversity as well as climate change issues. Both pillars, I believe, are quite important, although they are actually not integrated in many cases. But as the Dasgupta review suggests, there are correlations between conservation of biodiversity and climate change. How are they related? And what are the common aspects in trying to address these set of challenges? I would like to hear the view of Sir Partha on this, please.
Thank you very much. I can be very brief. There is a deep connection, of course, because of the reason I mentioned previously, that nature's services are interrelated with one another. You can't break them up into separate ones. Each affects the others. So in the case of climate change, we can see immediately that climate extreme events and so forth alters the composition of the biosphere. All right. Drier weather, for example, in some parts is going to convert forests into grasslands in due course. So the biodiversity impact of climate change on biodiversity, the spread of biodiversity, or the state, in this case, the state of ecosystems is clear enough. The reverse holds. If you cut down the rainforest, then it's going to change the wind patterns. And if nothing else, the ability to absorb carbon will be declining. Forests will become net emitters, not net absorbers. And so the direction of influence goes the other way as well. So yes, these are extremely connected problems. And in fact, in some ways, as I was arguing before, it is a mistake to isolate one of them from the other because they're related. And I think the right way to do it is to think, as I was suggesting, is to think of nature as a capital asset, the biosphere as a capital asset, and all the ecosystems as sub-assets, if you like. That's the natural capital sector, if you like, as opposed to the manufacturing sector, the industrial sector, and so forth, as we're familiar with, or the agricultural sector. We should be thinking in terms of the biosphere as a sector supplying us with goods and services that we enjoy.
Thank you for that. In future environmental policy, this is a point which we must heed very well. So it should not be a sectionalized approach that we should be taking. That would be very important. As I mentioned earlier, at this roundtable, we have many from the business sector who are listening in. Professor Sir Partha, you took up several issues in the review. And for the Japanese businesses or the businesses in the advanced countries, what actions would you expect them to take? What are your hopes for the actions that they should be taking?
Okay, my greatest hope is something that's not going to happen. It's a wish list, as it were, but it's such a simple wish list, the wish list, that I should mention it. Ideally, I would like to see our leaders, global leaders today, be as bold as the global leaders were at the end of the Second World War, when the countries in the Far East were on their knees. Europe was on its knees because it had been shattered by the war. But what happened? There was a Marshall Plan. There was, of course, there was huge determination of populations in the Far East to improve themselves, and there's the sacrifices they made to raise their economies through discipline and so forth. That's all there. But also, simultaneously, our world leaders created the World Bank and the IMF. Now, why did they do that? The idea was that there were certain global public goods which needed to be serviced, had to be supplied, but wouldn't happen otherwise without an international institution. So the World Bank was there to help development and reconstruction. Okay, and IMF was there to provide the global public good of financial stability of nations. And that cost money. We should now have something similar, but with a wider reach to manage the global commons, for example, the open oceans. We're not paying the price, any price, the accounting price or the accounting rent that the fee that we ought to be charged for shipping goods across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, across the Indian Ocean, all these oceans. Nobody pays any prices. You pay some port charges when you arrive at a country, but that's quite different. We're talking now about the fact that you're using the ocean for fishing, among one thing, and this huge transportation of trillions of dollars of goods that are shipped, oil tankers, the carriers of heavy-duty material and so forth. All that's happening, and that's encroaching on the oceans, which is an extremely important biome. It's one of the biggest capital assets we have, because without the oceans, without life in the oceans, we are dead, absolutely dead. And it's not in infinite supply, it's in finite supply, because the pressure on the oceans is huge now. Not just as a place where you dump your plastic and your effluent. That's one thing. The other is, of course, the use that we actually make in this transportation. We ought to be paying a price for it. And who can monitor it? Who can administer it? It can't be any particular nation, because the oceans are open. They're common resources. Nobody owns it. So we need to do that. And one of the suggestions was, not only can we should do that and then collect a rent, which can generate billions of dollars a year, a price that we ought to be paying for using it, by the way. So it's not a question of taxing income. It's really it's a price for a good that we use. Okay, that money could be used to compensate or pay countries in the tropics which house some of the greatest rainforests. Brazil is one of the countries, for example. They can legitimately say, we house these rainforests, they're providing a service to everybody else, but why should we necessarily be responsible for protecting them? Now, you may not agree with that argument, but the fact is that they are actually now deforesting like crazy. Malaysia is doing the same thing, Indonesia is doing the same thing, it's converted into plantations. We should be paying money to them as a way of ensuring that they do not then do that. They need compensation. It's called payment for ecosystem services, which many countries are adopting now. I believe Japan too. China does, Costa Rica does, England does. It's payment for ecosystem services. One party pays another party for the services that the other party's ecosystem is offering the party who is making the payment. We should do that. And we can easily afford to pay because we can charge the rents for using the global commons. Nothing like that is on the table. So that's the one thing I would really like to see happen. At least the review opens up that for discourse. And I think it may take time. Everybody will say there are problems with it. Of course, there's a problem with it. IMF was, people were arguing against the IMF too, presumably in 1948 or so, whenever it was. But we have to do that. A rational world would take economics seriously and say, yes, here are these major public goods, global public goods, and they're being trashed because we don't charge for them. So that's one thing I would like to see happen. I should say another thing, a final point. When I was talking about the role of the state in managing investment, as I was suggesting, I also had in mind not just the national governments, but local communities, local governments. In the UK, for example, councils, local councils, and village councils are responsible for looking after the common property resource, like the park. You know, each village has a park. We call it commons. Okay, so like a park. It's a field where people can play football or cricket and so forth. and children's playground. Those are very interesting developments. Sorry, they have been always there, but now they're becoming more greener in some ways. They're making those richer in biodiversity. These moves need to come from the local authorities, if you like, collective action at the local level. So the review talks in terms of collective action, starting from the local level, village level, up to the international level. And I began with the example of the international level, where we really could do with a international movement in creating an institution, given the power to set charges and monitor and invest also, reinvest in natural capital.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much indeed. Today, on Dasgupta review, we learned a lot about the framework as well as individual actors, actions that need to be taken going forward, and the roles to be played by the state as well as local governments and municipalities. The orientation and direction for all of us to go has been amply suggested. The issue of biodiversity is highly complicated, as suggested by Sir Partha. We do understand that, but because it is highly complex, we need to think about various solutions. There could be hints and clues for us to devise ways to bring solutions to the problems. And in trying to come up with those ideas and hints, the researchers, the businesses, and the consumers need to work closely together. That is what I have learned as a takeaway from this webinar. Once again, Sir Partha, thank you very much for very insightful presentation as well as comments. It was highly suggestive and provocative even, and I thank you so much.
Most welcome. You're most welcome. It was a pleasure meeting you again, and the incisive questions you've asked. It was a pleasure to have this discussion with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. それでは
So I would like to give the microphone back to Mr. Hasegawa.
大変どうもありがとうございました。時間を
Thank you very much, Sir Partha, Professor Onuma. With concrete examples, the explanations given were very easy to understand. We have greatly enhanced our understanding of the Dasgupta review. This is an online webinar, but we'd like to express our appreciation by a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
またご登壇いただきましたロングボトム大使
And Ambassador Longbottom and Ms. Britton and also Mr. Okuda, well, our thanks go to you as well. It seems we have received a lot of questions in the chat section. We could not take them up. We apologize. This concludes today's webinar. We'll be mailing you a short survey afterwards, and we'll be grateful for your candid feedback. Thank you very much indeed for your participation today.